Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on reference dependence, or reference dependent choice. In this section, we're going to contradict this assumption that goods have constant value regardless of presentation. This is a really important assumption for economics, and well, what we'll show is that it just doesn't tend to hold. The easiest way to demonstrate this is to say, okay, what do you say a good is on sale? And a place you may have seen this pretty commonly is on Amazon, who likes to list goods for this sort of market price, quote unquote, but no one's buying yoga mats for $50. They're using this as a device to show you that, hey, you're getting a deal relative to this thing that we never really intended to list goods at. And this will increase demand. It shouldn't increase demand because the good is $17, whether you have this $50 with a slash through it or not, but it does. On top of that, there's another example in here, which is why I use it, in that the $49.95 here shouldn't increase demand relative to just listing a good at $50, but it also does because people tend to only pay attention to the first digit here. So this assumption you guys will have seen in a lot of places is contradicted. Markets, digital markets tends to be a major one where firms have free reign on what they list. Another example could just be in daily interactions. Your willingness to pay for a good or service primarily, it should match your willingness to accept to perform an equivalency of that service to someone else, but usually our willingness to accept is much higher than our willingness to pay. In fact, we're going to say it's almost always higher than our willingness to pay. So we're not going to have this equivalent exchange where, okay, I would be willing to offer my neighbor maybe 20 bucks to mow my lawn, but I wouldn't take 20 bucks to mow their lawn, even though they're of similar sizes. And this is a common theme. The good is the same. It's still a transfer of a lawn mow, but my value of receiving the good and my value of giving the service is different. It costs me much more to perform the service than it is I'm willing to pay for the service myself. So this is a prime example of non-constant value. This is the endowment effect, where the value of owned goods is higher than the same value of a good if you don't own it. In this case, in this example above, this is an example of the endowment effect. The owned good is time. So my time I think of as more valuable because it's mine than my neighbor's because it's not mine. I'm not losing any of my time here in this case. So that's the endowment effect. We're going to visit each of these concepts I'm bringing up here on their own slides. Obviously, they're the focus of this chapter. So reference dependent utility. This says the value of goods largely, or the value of goods, the value of choices, the value of actions depends on references. The first example of this is income targeting, where workers will work based on an income goal, and that will change their decision for how many hours they choose to work or where they choose to work. Price anchoring or reference pricing, the value of a good depends on external reference. This is the example I gave at the beginning there, where the value of a good depends on the market price or the deal you're getting relative to market price, even though the market price is irrelevant to the actual utility, the actual value of that good. And the last example is kind of the application of all the above, called framing, where if you reframe a situation, if you present something differently, you're going to change the response from your audience. So the interpretation of a scenario can depend largely on the presentation. And this tends to be a pretty powerful tool for presentation of anything. So coming back to our baseline model, remember this is a rational decision maker. They're going to be optimizing their utility based on this model. We're going to slowly pick apart at it. In this case, we're going to show that the utility is not the utility of a given good on its own, but depends on the reference that actually has no effect to the value of the good, but it will change how individuals act. It will cause them to act inefficiently, so they're not actually maximizing utility. To start, we're going to explore largely the endowment effect. So there's plenty of examples here. If I own a cup of coffee, I value it at much higher than if I don't own it. So if it's mine, I probably won't sell it to someone if they come up and ask for, okay, how much would I sell my cup of coffee for at a coffee shop? People have done this experiment. It's kind of crazy. People won't sell their coffee for any price less than double the actual value, even though they can just go up and get a new coffee. It's kind of crazy. Brexit's a very large example of this. The whole Leave campaign was targeted on this, and we'll talk about this explicitly. They use the endowment effect constantly throughout their campaign. It's one of the main reasons why they were able to win. And, well, pretty poor for the rest of the world. You also saw the same with Donald Trump's campaign, but we'll talk about Brexit because there's a very good movie that explores this that I present in my class. Apple, kind of the king of behavioral economics and marketing. So we'll watch a video, or at least I'll put a link to the video for YouTubers of this associated tactic. I'll describe it when I give you guys, prompt you guys to watch that. Marketing in general, they frame things, they say it's your cart, it's yours. You're putting things in a basket, so that's implying ownership. So your cart away to it makes you feel ownership of goods. You don't want to close your basket once you've already put goods in there. So you'll likely check out once you've put things in your market basket, rather than just buying it and not feeling ownership over it in that process. And then free trials. This is a technique to get you to experience the service or a subscription service primarily so that you feel endowed to it and you don't want to part with it. So you're likely to let it automatically renew. It's not just forgetfulness at that 14-day expiry period. It's also the fact that, okay, I've gotten used to having this thing, so I want to have it. So I'm not likely to close this free trial. Now, the endowment effect, as mentioned earlier, is when a goods that's owned has its value inflated by the owner relative to the good unowned. So parting with an object is felt as a loss, and people really dislike loss. That's what we're going to show. It's called prospect theory. So that's going to be the underlying theoretical model here of this chapter. What we're going to say for the endowment effect is very simply that the willingness to accept to part with something that you own, a good or like a cell phone, right? The willingness to accept for me to sell the cell phone to someone else is higher than I would pay to get access to a similar cell phone. So the willingness to accept to part with something that you own is higher than your willingness to pay for that thing to own even a new one of those things. Now, what I want you to think about here is what is the best value of measure? Is it your willingness to accept for goods that you own, or is it your willingness to pay for the goods that you own? How would we build an accurate measure of value? I'll give you a few seconds here just to think about this, to have an internal answer, and then I'll prompt you with the most common response. And of course, I put value in quotations here because it's an abstract measure. Even though we talk about it mathematically as sort of a fact, it's really only at best an abstract measure. And the reason for that is, well, willingness to accept tends to be the best measure of value. But how do we measure welfare or consumer surplus? It's with the willingness to pay. So willingness to pay is what's used to measure your consumer surplus. Excuse me. So pretty importantly, we should be measuring willingness to accept because that's really what people value the things that they own at, but we measure willingness to pay, how much they paid for those goods that they own now. So this gap is pretty important here. It's going to represent some maybe inaccuracies in estimation. It's not really going to be a big issue because there tends to be a proportion here that's common. The willingness to accept is proportionally maybe like 10% higher than the willingness to pay, usually like 50% higher is the measure. So it's all proportionate. So we could get back basically the willingness to accept. We just modify things by an extra 50%. So it's not a big deal, but it's going to make markets pretty inefficient, as we're going to see, just for exchange, not just for measurements of governments. So here, prospect theory, this underlines all of our reference-dependent utility. It's pretty simple. The idea here is that losses are felt harder than gain. It hurts much more to lose something than it feels good to gain the same thing. This is called loss aversion. It's a very, very old concept in psychology. Kahneman Tversky, they're psychologists, they brought it over into behavioral economics, and they really originated the field with this paper here in 1979. So the idea here is your utility and disutility are on a graph. You have a concave marginal utility of gain, or just utility of gain rather, and a convex marginal utility of loss, such that the utility loss from $50 lost or something $50 of value lost is larger than the gain of $50 for the same, well, monetary value. Now, there's a modern version that I prefer. I like to present. I kind of have to present the old one because they're such pivotal names in the literature, Kahneman Tversky. But I prefer Kozagi and Rabin's model, where you have a discontinuous drop of marginal utility of the reference points. So if I'm overcoming a loss, I'm maybe like reclaiming money gambling. So I'm at the casino and I'm making back money that I had lost. I feel a gain to that money, but then as soon as I start making money here, I feel less of a gain. So I'm most likely to stop as soon as I break even, essentially, because we have this discontinuous drop, and we'll show how that acts as a primo decision making point, that discount. But first, we're going to talk about a classical example here using the endowment effect to show how this can make markets inefficient. To begin, we're going to sort of explain what is Adam Smith's invisible hand. It says that private bargaining is going to correct surpluses or shortages within markets that are out of equilibrium. So in this case, if I have what we call inefficient rationing, where we just give a bunch of goods in a market to individuals that have a low value of those goods, those are the lowest marginal benefit, get the goods first, then we're going to, and we also have a shortage in the market, we're going to have these buyers, this demand, because the effective price, because all these people that have this low value are able to get the good, the effective price is low. So there's a lot of people that want the good, these guys here, that aren't able to get it because the effective price is so low. And what the invisible hand says is that these guys, well, I'm going to name two of them, Ringo and George, they're going to communicate with one another. George has this good and he only values it at $20. His willingness to pay is $20. Ringo, he says I would pay $40 to get that good. And because George only values the good at $20, they should be able to find a trade. So George is going to sell the good to Ringo at let's see, $20. So George just sells it at Ringo's willingness to pay. So he sells it to him at $40. And in that exchange, George is effectively gaining $20 in value because he only valued the good at $20. Ringo's going to break even. So these guys will then all sell the goods to these guys here. That creates an essential price in the market up here, which is pretty high. And that creates a surplus where now sellers say, oh, hey, the price is really high, so I can start marking my good up. But there's few people that will buy the goods. So the sellers end up with this large surplus and they see this higher price and this extra inventory. And what do? They put these goods on sale. So they lower the price until the good gets on sale. Sorry, I had a gap in where I showed the visual there. So they lower the price until you get basically a market clearing where there's no real reason to reduce price any longer, and you end up with this equilibrium. Yep. So that's the invisible hand. These guys here, they have incentive to sell to these guys because there's some mutually beneficial trade that can occur, and it's going to let the market eventually get back to equilibrium as sellers start seeing prices increase or secondary resale market prices increase. And well, they'll start either selling more by raising their prices, sorry, supplying more by raising their prices, and then selling off the excess inventory by lowering their prices, ultimately reaching this equilibrium where supply meets demand. But the issue here is that willingness to accept is greater than willingness to pay. So let's think of everyone as having sort of a flat rate where willingness to accept is much larger than willingness to pay. And George, since he's going to get the good first, since we have inefficient rationing here, he's going to bargain based on his willingness to accept rather than his willingness to pay because he has to part with the good that he owns. So George's willingness to pay is $20. Ringo's willingness to pay is $40. He doesn't have the good. Sorry, this visual's off. Let's go to the next slide. But George's willingness to accept, he would take to part with the good, to sell the good, is much larger because he values his willingness to accept is larger than his willingness to pay by $25 here. So his willingness to accept is $45, but Ringo's only willing to pay $40 to get this good. So only a few of these buyers with higher willingness to pay will make this exchange. Only a few of them. George won't because he can't find a buyer that values the good at more than he values owning the good. So he can't make this mutually beneficial trade anymore. Some people, some buyers will, some people will. I guess in the graphic here I put it as George parting with his good for someone that values the good as slightly more than Ringo. But the price can only adjust to a certain point. It can only adjust up to the equilibrium price minus $25 because these guys here with this willingness to pay won't sell to the people above them. They won't sell to the buyers that actually value it at equilibrium. So you're only ever going to adjust to the equilibrium price minus the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. Sorry, I should have had that pop up earlier. So coming back to this, we're going to do an example where we'll start with inverse supply of P equaling 2QS. plus 6, and this inverse demand. I'm just going to walk through the math here because it's a little bit boring to explain math. I think the YouTube audience would primarily be interested in the concepts. We have this gap in the willingness to accept and the willingness to pay, and the price is going to start out at $50. So the price starts out here at $50. What price will the market shift to when buyers exhibit the endowment effect? And then what shortage will persist in the market when this too low of a price sets in? So the equilibrium price is only ever going to come up to the actual equilibrium price if you don't have cognitively biased individuals, if you don't have people with the endowment effect, minus $12, because that's the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. So the actual equilibrium price here is going to be um, $72. So we could get back this. Let's see in the math here. What was the math I did here? Oh, geez. All right. Well, let's just say it's $72, the equilibrium price. I can't recall how I've got this, but it's quite simple. Take supply equal to demand, set the price equivalent to each other, solve for Q, plug that Q in to get P to either equation. So the actual price is $72. Then the equilibrium price that's going to be reached is only $60. So that means that $60 is what we're going to plug in here for prices rather than the actual equilibrium price of $72. That means that we're going to have some excess supply or demand. In this case, excess supply. And we ended up with a 3-unit shortage here. Now, hold on here. This is a surplus. I've done something horribly wrong in this example. In my textbook, it's correct, so I can guarantee you guys that. Apologies for that. Let's cut through that example there. It should be quite simplistic. Maybe I'll adjust this. Hold on. I'm going to pause the recording and I'm going to adjust this to be the correct example here. All right, and we're back. So let's run through this example again. Apologies for that. And now it's a little bit out of order. Anyways, I've adjusted it so we've swapped the Q's and the S's here. Or sorry, the Q's and the P's. So now this thing's proper. We're going to start out at a price of $20. The equilibrium price that we reach, if we set the Q's equal to each other, we're going to get 6P if we add over the 4P, and we subtract over the 6 here to get 6P equals 198. We divide 198 by 6, we're going to get $33. And the actual price that we reach is $21. And the shortage that will persist in the market, we put that $21 into our equations. We get the quantity supplied is $48. The quantity demanded is $120. Apologies for that. I switch my examples every time I teach because at my school, cheating is pretty prevalent. So students like to copy off the answers from previous students. So I have to adjust these all the time. So usually what I do is I just flip Q and S or Q and P. I think that's what happened here. So apologies, the example got out of hand. All right. Now we're going to get into reference dependent proper. So reference dependence proper. What we're going to do is we're going to start with prospect theory. We're going to come back to this. We're going to say that, okay, premise of reference dependence is that losses are felt harder than gain. So how things are phrased matters. You can frame things as a loss that people are maybe more galvanized to pursue an activity. So you can engage loss aversion by implying a loss or inferring a gain when someone is maybe missing out on a deal. You're going to miss out on this gain you could have. So in the future, if you don't take advantage of that gain, it's a loss. Some examples for maybe a presentation. In my class, we do a policy presentation. Instead of discussing costs, you can discuss a preventable loss. So rather than saying this thing costs this much, this policy that isn't really useful costs this much, okay, it is a preventable loss. Society is losing this much money. We can change that. We can recoup this loss. We can avoid losing this money in the future. You can visualize what can be done or what can be bought, what can be endowed on people with money that they save by a policy, for instance, so they feel the endowment effect. You can also talk about what good outcomes are missed. What is your opportunity cost of a policy? What are you losing that you could be gaining, rather? And what are the losses if the policy is not in place or delayed? So discussing everything as loss or making your audience feel like they're endowed with something is a good way of engaging framing and incurring a larger response from that audience. Now, Brexit, as I mentioned earlier, was a prime example of this. Their slogan was "Take back control." So the back in that slogan, it implies that they've lost something that must be reclaimed. On top of this, the Leave campaign, they focused on foreign spending, saying this was a loss. So they implied that all of our spending, or all of Britain's spending rather, in Europe was a loss rather than we were getting some services back for that spending. Or, sorry, not we, but Britain was getting some services back for that spending. They just said, okay, we're losing this much money, so focus on that. On top of its Brexit, they integrated nationalism and hatred for other countries to make their campaign go through the Leave campaign. This implied a disruption of the status quo, which is an example of social preferences. So that'll be a top 2 chapters from now is when we'll explore that. Um, and they also used a lot of what's the word for it? Not machine learning, but data science. A lot of big data techniques is the word they used. Personalized targeted ads for individuals. So they applied directly to individuals with specialized content to make them feel a personal connection to that campaign. And this is also seen in Trump versus Biden. They used the same company in both Brexit and Trump versus Biden. Trump rather used it. So they really galvanized people to vote because they made it feel like if you weren't voting um, for the winner, you were voting for. Sorry, you weren't voting for who would win. You were voting for against basically who you want to lose between Trump and Biden. It made basically third-party candidates alienated in this campaign. And apologies here. The personalized ads, they were used in Trump versus Clinton, not Trump versus Biden necessarily. At least they weren't proved to have been used in Trump versus Biden. So Brexit's an example of framing. It's a really, really important one because it drastically affected, well, the whole world. It affected America, where I am, as well, because the tactics were used by the candidate to get elected just a few months later. Now, coming back to prospect theory, the important thing here is that this drop here in marginal utility, so the marginal benefit of performance of activity, that instantaneous drop, it's going to make a unique stopping point. So this spike here, it's going to make it so that, okay, if you have some marginal cost that's in the middle here, something like here, then when you have this drop, you go from the marginal benefit of an activity being above that marginal cost to that marginal benefit now being below this marginal cost that you stop almost exactly when you hit the reference. And there's several applications of that behavior. Income targeting, which is prospect theory applied to labor economics, where workers have an income goal in mind and they'll work less when wages high because they meet their goal early. So this is going to be really, really inefficient over time because you're going to work less when you could work more and make a higher wage and then save so you have to work less overall over the course of like a month or a year. Now, price anchoring and reference pricing, this is prospect theory applied to industrial organization. The market price or competitor's price will form references, and that will be used to make customers perceive prices as a loss or as a gain relative to some anchor, and they'll make decisions that aren't based on the value. So the best product isn't winning in this case. And framing is prospect theory applied generally, twisting around the presentation of goods or goods, services, choices. So you get the behavior you want out of it. And this, of course, leads to the best choice very rarely prevailing when information is twisted around in this way. Now we're going to start by exploring income targeting. So that's where we'll begin. We'll outline the theory here where workers have an income targets G in mind when they're working. When a worker achieves their goal, what happens is they no longer feel a loss. They don't feel loss aversion because they've made income relative to the goal that they were working towards. And this is what we're going to say is this decreases their marginal benefit from working more because they're no longer working to overcome this income target. So workers, they're always going to, any decision maker, they're always going to do an activity until the marginal benefit is less than or equal to the marginal cost. And that's going to be their stopping point. So when the marginal benefit is less than or equal to the marginal cost, that's when anyone stops. So for working with income targeting, there's 3 options for optimal hours. You can never meet your income target, which means that you work up until basically you reach your increase, your inflated marginal benefit of working because of the fact that you feel loss aversion. You feel some loss aversion that pushes you to work towards an income target, and you never quite make that income target. You get too exhausted before you meet it. The marginal cost of work is usually upward sloping because the more you work, the more tired you get. And well, that leads to a high marginal cost of continuing to work. So what could happen is you never meet your income target, which you work basically for a long time and you don't meet the target that you want. And this is most likely if your wages are pretty low. You could meet your income target and stop. So you work, 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 and then you make the target income that you have, and then you stop at that point because now the marginal cost of working is above the marginal benefit. And this is likely if wages are kind of in the middle. Or you could meet your income target early and then you work until you meet your actual marginal benefit equal to marginal cost, your rational stopping points here. And this is most likely if wages are high. And from left to right here, you're going to see that the hours chosen are larger when wages are low, and the hours chosen are smaller when wages are high because of this income targeting behavior. And we're going to go through 3 examples of this to outline this. The first example, we're going to say that workers, they feel $8 worth of loss aversion when they're below their targets of $200 in this example. And this worker earns $5 an hour. And workers, this guy's going to feel exhaustion. So the more he works, and he's going to have an upward sloping marginal cost function for that reason. So we're going to have our marginal benefit and marginal cost here. So the marginal benefit of work is going to be equal to the wages. That's what you're gaining from working, is the wages that you take home, plus the $8 of loss aversion if you're below your income target. If you achieve your income target, then you only really gain the marginal benefit of your wages. You're not overcoming this $8 of loss in this case. And your marginal cost function, we're just going to give something here. Ambiguous, it doesn't matter what we give. This is the example we're going to use is $3 plus half a dollar for every hour we work is going to be our marginal cost. Now, to approach these problems, to figure out what the optimal hours worked, we're going to first solve assuming that a worker's target isn't met. So when his marginal benefit here, his upper marginal benefits, is equivalent to his marginal cost. So the $3.50 or $3 plus basically one half a dollar every hour is equivalent to his wage, which in this case is $5 per hour, plus his loss aversion, 8. So 13. And we'll solve this for h. We're going to get 13 minus 3 divided by that 1/2. That's going to be equivalent to 20. So he'd work 20 hours in this case. Then what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, does the worker meet his income target if he works his $20 or 20 hours? In this case, the answer is going to be no. He's only going to make $100, so he's going to be below his income target of $200, which means he does not meet his target. And that means that the worker is going to work until he hits this upper bound here. He's working until he intersects this red line. And that intersection comes before the income target's met. So this 20 hours that he chooses to work is going to be his optimal stopping point. So he's going to go until he intersects this upper line. And you could also do this graphically. You could draw out the lines. That may be an easier way to solve this, but this method also works. So next example, we're going to change his wage from $5 an hour to $10 an hour. We would expect, if he's rational, right, is he works more hours because now his wage is doubled. Should be pretty lucrative to work more. What we're going to see is, again, solve when we assume that he doesn't meet his target. So he's going to work until his marginal benefits, or sorry, marginal cost is 18. So 18 minus 3 divided by 1/2 is 30. 30 hours if he works until he doesn't meet his target. But we now ask ourselves, does he meet his target? And in this case, if he works the 30 hours, he's going to make $30. $10 an hour times 30 hours, $300. So he does meet his target. This means at some point his marginal benefit changes from this high upper bound to the lower bound here. So next what we have to ask is, does the worker stop exactly when he meets his target, or does he keep working beyond that point? So to do that, we have to find what's the marginal cost when he meets his target. So we take the $200, which is his target, and we divide it by how much he earns per hour to figure out how many hours does it take for him to reach his income target. In this case, that's 20 hours. And at 20 hours, we plug this into his marginal cost function up here. At 20 hours, we have 20 times 1/2, which is 10, plus 3 is 13, is his marginal cost. And that marginal cost there is greater than his marginal benefit, which is $10 here, because now he's at this point, he's met his target. So he does stop when he meets his income target. We have this sort of situation where now the marginal benefit curve has jumped the marginal cost curve so that the marginal cost of continuing to work is higher than the marginal benefit of continuing to work because I feel satisfaction for making my income target. And of course, I'm giving you guys the examples so that we're going in order here. So we're going to have met the target now before we're going to continue working. So we're just going to blow through this. It would take this worker 34 hours to meet his target. He's surely going to meet his target there because we showed earlier, right, at a lower wage, you meet your target before this point. Now we ask, does he stop when he meets his target? So what's the marginal cost when he meets his target? In this case, he would have worked 16 and 2/3 hours. At that point, the marginal cost is only 11.335, which is actually below the marginal cost, or sorry, the marginal benefit of working, which is the wage, is $12. So he works a little bit more. He works up until then his rational stopping point when the marginal cost equals the actual marginal benefit, the wages here. So that's going to be 18 hours. So we have this situation here where he works until his marginal cost is actually equal to his wage. Now I do have a fourth example on here, and this is when we really jack up the wages here to 4 times our original starting point, where he's workers earning $20 an hour. And again, we're going to continue working until we get the rational meeting point here. But because the wage is so high, oh, sorry, I forgot I cut out things. That rational working point is much larger than before. So we actually increase the number of hours we're working. We're working 34 hours, whereas remember at the beginning we worked, what was it, 20 hours, right? So now we're actually working more when wages increase. So there's a region where you're going to be decreasing work hours as your wages increase, and there's a region where you're going to be increasing work hours as your wage increases. So this is our two models. We have income targeting here in red, standard labor supply in blue, and this is the relationship between hours worked, optimal hours chosen, and the wages. For wages being too low to meet your income target, you're going to increase how many hours you choose to work as the wage grows. But there's going to be this region where we lower our work hours chosen as our wages grow. This is the region between that $10 an hour and $12 an hour point up until we get to the $20 an hour point where we do start increasing our work hours again because now we're meeting our income target so early that it doesn't really impact our choices. So this is our behavioral model of labor supply here for income targeting versus standard labor supply. And this is derived in the textbook. I don't derive it in my class. It's a little bit too complex, but I do go through it step by step in the textbook if anyone's interested. And these are our graphs here in more detail. Now, in the real world, we've seen income targeting being evidenced in quite a few settings. The first was New York taxi drivers. This was the most significant. So the first paper that started this all, which was Karmer et al., one of the authors in here was Richard Thaler. He's the one we quote from quite frequently in the book. What they do is they find negative wage hours elasticity. They find a downward sloping relationship between how many hours I choose to work and what my so hours chosen to work is the y-axis and wage is the x-axis. So they find a downward sloping relationship there, which means I earn more, I work less. On top of this, they find that there's no correlation in hours chosen between days. So if I earned a lot yesterday, it doesn't have an impact on today. People are making decisions, or taxi cab drivers are making decisions on a daily basis, and they're reevaluating their target after that. And to have empirical validity here, they use an instrumental variable, which is rain. So they use that to instrument for high wages so that they are not using an endogenous variable, which I guess at this stage you wouldn't necessarily have had econometrics. So I don't go too much into detail here. I just say, is this identified or not? And we'll talk about it. So they identified this using rain as an instrument. Farber's papers here, Farber's early papers in 2005 and 2008, he shows that drivers are more likely to stop if they have high earnings, and he also uses rain as an instrument. He improves the model slightly from this 1997 one, and he collects a new data set that's a little bit bigger. This paper here, Crawford and Meng, which I think is one of the best in the literature, although there's some stuff wrong with the actual coding that goes into kind of figuring out what are the values to the analysis. This paper here shows that drivers not only stop when they meet an earning goal, but they also stop when they meet their hours goal. They have both an earning goal in mind and an hour goal in mind. And whichever one comes second between these goals is where they stop. So that's a pretty interesting result. They have two targets here. In this case, the second one is the binding target. And the most recent paper exploring taxi, sorry, not the most recent, but one of the more impactful papers exploring taxi cab drivers, it collects a very full sample of drivers. So it's all drivers in New York City. And this is done by Farber. So remember earlier he said there was income targeting. Now he's going to say that there's no income targeting. The first thing he does is he shows that wage does not increase wages, which invalidates the instrument you needed to identify previous papers. And he shows that some drivers in the sample, they do income target and work inefficiently, but they're the ones that don't last very long in the industry. They're filtered out in the market over time. So they work maybe 1 to 2 years versus a 3 to 5 year tenure being the norm for taxi cab drivers. This paper, though, it does leave some gaps. The taxi cab industry, it actually has very small wage variation. So these drivers, their wages don't change much over a day. So you don't really see much room for income targeting to take place. And taxi cab drivers, they don't actually have any wage growth. So they don't earn more as they work more and more as taxi cab drivers. They earn the same basically flat rates on average. So you don't really see if targets change, if income targets shift over time. Now, out of Farber's paper, there were two really interesting ones that came about. Thractal and Toe is one of the most interesting ones. This guy said, as opposed to having flat targets, straightforward targets, they say targets can adjust. And what happens there? What they do is they show the with very weak significance, but they do show income targeting using that same sample. So that's pretty important. So the taxi cab drivers, their targets adjust. Maybe if it's rain on a given day, they'll have one income target. If there's a holiday, they'll have another income target that's higher. But the method that they used to estimate this was pretty noisy in that it was really imprecise. So it's really hard to get significant results there. Then we have Hagar et al. They say the most experienced drivers will make the highest wage and can control themselves. They're sophisticated agents. So what this does is since you see most experienced drivers in the sample, that biases results towards the positive wage elasticity. So reweighting the sample of Farber, they're able to show basically income targeting. Um, Oh God. Sorry for this. Just popping these all up in there. So they have a lot of conclusions. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's an interesting paper, and what they really show is driver learning drives the results of Farber. Some flaws in this literature. Rain, of course, is not an actual wage shot. Most of the methods in the literature rely on status quo earnings. Of course, Fractal and Toe is the exception to this. Targets, they might adjust from day to day. So if you use a static figure, it doesn't work too well. Exhaustion might work. It might drive the choice to work less hours. Maybe if you're earning a lot as a taxi cab driver, that means you're driving too much on the road, and that wears you out and causes you to work less. So there's all these identification issues. And there's an external validity issue here, of course, where that it only studies the taxi industries, and taxi drivers are pretty unique workers. On top of this, they have pretty small sample sizes, the ones that find income targeting. Of course, well, Farber's paper in 2015 has a very large sample size, but this one shows no income targeting, so it's not interesting. Now, there's been a lot of other settings that have been explored for income targeting. I only have a select few here. These are the bigger ones. So, Fair and Goats, they study bike messengers. They show income targeting, but since you have exhaustion and chosen work hours, it might just be the case that the more you earn, the more you have to bike, and that wears you out pretty quick. So you stop working then. Moss in 2006 here, he showed, like he studied police officers and showed not just income targeting, but also fairness involved. So your clearance rate changes based on basically the arbitration for how much your wages should be. If an arbitrator rules for the union, so they pay you less, you increase your work hours to earn more. If the arbitrator rules for the employer, you earn or you work fewer hours. Sorry, you work less hard. Delvinia et al. In 2017, he showed income targeting for job search. Basically, job effort spikes when the unemployment benefits expire. So this gives a time reference for search length. It depends on effort. And one of my papers here should be Barbaros and Kazin. Sorry about that. In 2022, it studies YouTube content creators. It shows that when you have a randomized income and wage shock, a viral video in this case, you do have income targeting seen. So we're going to go through the results of my paper, of course, now. So YouTube, it's interesting. You'll see basically a homepage if you log into YouTube. If you click on a video, you're going to see recommended videos. And these recommended videos, that's going to depend on YouTube's algorithm. And YouTube's algorithm depends on productivity of users. The more you produce after you have a viral video, the more likely you are to show up in someone's homepage. The recommended videos, if you click on someone channel's videos, are usually just other videos of that channel, though there are exceptions. So if a video goes viral, it's going to have a surge of viewership, and this is driven through viewer to viewer sharing and also the recommendation algorithm. That viewership is going to spill over into your other videos. So any new video that you make, it's going to be more likely to be put up onto someone's homepage, and it's going to pop up here. So viewers of your viral video see it and they watch it, and that increases your wages here. So your wages exogenously increase, but what happens after you have a viral video in this period 0 is that you produce less. Seen in several different ways. You upload fewer videos and you actually upload shorter time periods of videos. So the total minutes of video you upload each week drops, and it drops significantly, 30% for videos uploaded, 70% for video length uploaded. And there's also just the choice to work a given week or not changes based on if you've met your income target, if you have a viral video. So this sort of exogenous wage shock, this exogenous increase to wages, this thing that boosts your wages unexpectedly, causes you to work less. And when you do work less in this week, you're much less likely to pick up, like videos in these later weeks are not picked up by the algorithm here. So you lose the advantage, the massive advantage of having a large wage earnings in the future. And this is pretty poor. Now, the last example here of reference dependence, price anchoring, we're going to go through. There's plenty of examples. Okay, I already went over this market price mean slash, but you also have comparison to competitors saying, oh, hey, I have 50% off these competing plans, even though my plan's much worse. You can show different bundles to try and push people towards a particular method. In this case here, right, they're kind of gauging $25 of you and putting that in very fine print, so you don't see that. There's plenty of examples of this, and of course, Amazon's a massive one. So price anchoring, you guys should be pretty familiar with it. Consumers use established prices to infer loss or gain and use that to direct them to where they should purchase. So when goods are represented as a sale, customers perceive a gain and they're more likely to buy in this case. When they're presented as a limited time only sale, they perceive a potential loss in the future if they don't take advantage of that sale and they don't consider other goods. They just go for that limited time only sale. On top of this, when goods are presented as an upgrade rather than being just shown as their own actual price, people just view that upgrade price. So they're not paying attention to the actual price they're paying for a good. They're paying attention to how much do I have to pay to upgrade this good. And so they're inferring based on too low of a price their decisions. Now, this is distinct from context effects, which are also known as menu effects. But price anchoring is a really, really important subset of these. Context effects we're going to go through in great detail later in the course. Now, master of price anchoring here, Steve Jobs. It can be seen when he launched the iPad. I'll just describe the video here, and I'll try and put the link in below if the link still works. I think I looked earlier and the link's no longer working. But anyways, the master of price anchoring is really Steve Jobs. When he launched the iPad, what he did is he leaked to the press a price of $1,000 to establish a reference when he only ever intended to sell the iPad for $500. So he was able to show, oh, it's half off of this number I made up and leaked to the press to increase sales early on. So he leaked his own press or his own figure here to establish a reference and let the press do his dirty work for him. Yeah, and he had many, many examples of this. If you look at that video where he launched the iPad, you'll see also this upgrading feature. So people are perceiving spending less money when they're upgrading goods. Now, one of the first markets that studied, or that was studied by economists for price anchoring, was the housing market. Others were like the stock market, studied quite readily by behavioral financiers. Not horrifically robust, but it's also too complex a market, so we won't study it here. And then the car market's pretty significant for price anchoring. Now, most markets have studied price anchoring to some degree. It's a side side portion of study in one of my papers, where we study crowdfunding. The primary focus there is context effects, but sort of a side benefit is we identify price anchoring there. But the housing markets, where we'll cover here for this course, I'll mention some of my results as well since they apply to the modern day. But for housing markets here, we have Genesov and Meyer. What they do is they have a reference point established based on the previous purchase price, so when you bought your house, and they look at how owners determine what price to list their house for. If owners are loss averse, they're unwilling to sell their price at a loss relative to their initial purchase price. They studied this market that had a significant fluctuation in prices. So they had an early increase in prices where some people bought houses in this period, which is in the late 80s. And then they had a sort of decline in the market. So owners were unwilling to sell their houses at this time. And what they saw was that if a house is owner occupied, they increase the price they're having to sell the house at. The loss in price here increases the price proportional to that loss. So owners try and recoup about 35% of the loss they had when they bought the house versus when they sold it. And they'll list their prices or their houses at too high a price. And you have this heterogeneous impact on owners versus like investors, people that flip houses or landlords that rent houses. But what's just the general impact of people being unwilling to sell their homes at reasonable prices? Especially when an owner, someone that owns a house that lives in the home, is going to have to charge a higher price because they feel a loss than an investor, someone that's flipping a home really quickly and selling it. What's going to happen is, well, the owners are going to be competing with people that have not an unfair advantage, but that are willing to list houses at lower prices. So the owners get stuck. They can't relocate to new jobs because they want to list houses at too high of a price. On top of this, investors are going to dominate the market, which means they can set prices and they can achieve quick turnover, which enables them to undercut owners and further kind of get owners stuck in their area. On top of this, renters might come in if you have too many investors turning over homes, and renters tend to hurt home value. There's been a few examples of this in the housing market where it's been studied that too many renters in an area hurts the home value because renters don't value the property as much as owners, so they're more likely to be belligerent and damage other properties, which limits the value of those other homes. Now, the easiest example to understand, we're going to end on this, is sales. So you could see a good on sale relative to itself. We're going to use the example of Kickstarter here, where you have what are called early bird sales for a limited time only. You have this small sale where people perceive a $5 gain that they could lose on if they don't take advantage of it. Examples here. What we show in my paper is that if you use this mechanism, you increase your demand by 80% without doing anything. You just say, okay, this good's going on sale. So just saying that, you increase demand by quite a bit, by 80%. And on Kickstarter, the kicker here is that these goods don't exist yet. So you're not really putting on sale relative to anything else. You can just sort of claim whatever price you want because these goods don't exist yet. So you can just increase demand by 80% for doing nothing. Now, price anchoring through sales is going to increase demand drastically, and limited time only is going to have a stronger effect since they feel like they're losing something. But what are some examples of price anchoring here? We're going to go through many you would have seen. Amazon's market price, grocery store, they use the yellow tag for representing original price, and they sell you something at a discount. Oftentimes you'll see almost everything have these yellow tags at grocery stores. Car dealerships, they're going to reference things to Kelley Blue Book value, so you feel like you're getting a deal. This was before the shortage, not the shortage, but the drastic increase in price, which was associated with fewer imported chips from computer chips from China. So Kelley Blue Book value is no longer a good thing. MSRP is also something car dealerships use to try and bargain you up on prices to say, oh, hey, you should pay close to this MSRP because you're getting a huge deal we're giving you. It's really very the correlation between Kelley Blue Book value or MSRP and car value is really, really low, surprisingly low. I don't know the figure off the top of my head. Competitive pricing, if companies compare their prices to other companies, usually it's irrelevant because they're going to compare their cheapest bundle to the other company's most expensive bundle, and they're going to drive up sales in that way. And finally, bundling, where they offer you like volume discounts. They say you save this amount, this this amount of percentage if you do bundle, and they drive up sales in that way. Now, I do have some other examples in here. There's interesting examples of tax illusion, but it's kind of too much material to fit into these shorter lectures, so I cut the lecture here. That's reference dependence. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.